Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. And we're going to be doing something very exciting tonight. We're going to be taking a look at some of the inner parts of the Bible and the meaning, which is probably more often than not beyond the scope of what most people have access to. So it should be very exciting. Hopefully we will enable everybody to have a proper understanding. Now, don't get me wrong, at the end of tonight's webinar, you will not be a master Kabbalist. That's not our goal. It's important to understand that. If we know what our goal is, we'll walk out happy as opposed to disappointed. So the goal isn't to make everybody into a master Kabbalist. It's just to enable everybody to understand the basic ideas that we want to cover in tonight's webinar, tonight's workshop from the Hebraics Institute. With that being said, we won't make you suffer to have to look at the instructor the entire time. Rather, we will instead share with you a lot of different texts for you to look at yourself, to join along with me. And this way you actually get to see the source material from where this arrives. I like in all of my courses to provide you with, as I often repeat, the ability to fish rather than to give you the fish. The goal is to empower you to be able to understand the Bible in a way that perhaps you may not have had the ability until now. But again, with the tools, the important aspect here is that you're provided with the tools and the knowledge, with the skills, however, to be able to understand and put this into practice. Now, with that being said, let's just see over here. We're going to try, and we're still, I hope everybody will bear with me. We're trying to make sure that the technology works with us as opposed to against us. And more often than not, we find that the latter is the case, that it sometimes works against us instead of with us. But we'll do our best, and hopefully it'll cooperate this time. Let's see here. So we are going to, and I'm going to ask everybody tonight to participate with me. I just want to give you a little bit of a heads up. And we're going to make it very easy for you. When we ask you to participate, I'll ask you to share either a 1 or a 2 or something similar to that. I'm going to enable the chat box, which is going to be open on the right side. And I'd like everybody to say hi and where you're from. So you'll see that pop up over there on the right side. And if you can join me by just saying hi and let us know where you're from, that would be wonderful. And then in that box on the right side that you see there, I'll ask you for you to input numbers in response to many of the questions that I'll be asking you. All right. So I'm glad to see everybody's with me and everybody's responding already. What we're going to do is as follows. We're going to share our screen with you right now, and I'm going to ask as soon as you do see that. No, that's not the one we want to share. Just a second. Let's make sure that this is cooperating in the way it should be. See here. There we go. Okay. There we go. That should work a lot better. And there we go. And we're in business. So you should be able to see the page that I'm looking at right now. At this moment, it'll be the Hebraics Institute with the logo, which is the tree, and the path with the background of a scroll, or the words and the letters in the scroll. If you're able to see that, please type the number 5 and press enter, and we will continue as soon as we know everybody's with me and on the same page, literally and figuratively. Okay. So, what is tonight's workshop about? Tonight's workshop is as follows. The story behind Hebraics, before we get into the actual details of the workshop, the webinar tonight, is I'd like to introduce to you a little bit of my story in 1 minute, give you the background behind this. I personally am a rabbi in Missouri, and one of my responsibilities here was to run a Judaica shop, a store that sold Jewish ritual items as well as Jewish books. And what amazed me, in short, was how many non-Jews were searching for answers and meaning and access to the Bible and details about ancient biblical rituals, etc., that were coming to me, or a Jewish source in that sense, to provide that information to them, and they were not finding it elsewhere. So that's, in short, literally, in 10 seconds, the story behind the creation of the Hebraics Institute. Now, if you've been on any of our previous workshops, then you'll know that this is also something, especially the biblical prophecy one, was something that we actually covered. This is the fruition, the realization of many of the biblical prophecies of old, in particular several from Isaiah and Chizkiyahu, Ezekiel, etc. So that's a story, a little bit about what the background behind the Hebraics Institute is. And the goal of the Hebraics Institute is to enable you to know the Bible as you've never known it before. Within the Bible, it's important to start off by saying many people misunderstand a certain component, that the Bible is not a book, it's rather a way of life. And the term for the Bible in Hebrew, even though, as we've done when we did the map of the Bible, we've got into detail there, we're not going to do that tonight, that was a different webinar, but generally in Hebrew it's also referred to with a general name as the Torah. And the word Torah means lesson. That's the actual meaning, the literal meaning of the word Torah. So the Bible is a way of life. It's a guide to life. It's a lesson in how to be a divine being, a divine person, someone who follows in the path that God wants for us. And the Torah, therefore, in the Bible, has a guide for all humanity. It has meaning. In particular, we refer to them as 7 universal laws, sometimes known as 7 Noahide laws, because the 7th was given to Noah after the flood. However, tonight we're going to focus on one particular component of that, and not so much as a direct meaning of the 7 universal laws, even though there are many different biblical commandments, etc. Those don't necessarily apply to everybody universally like the 7 universal laws do. So I encourage everybody to do a little bit of research on those, because those are goals and guides for all mankind. That applies to everyone equally, and that's something that preceded the giving of the Bible and the Torah as a commandment in its own right. But tonight, our goal is, in general, to enable you to know the Bible as you've never known it before. Tonight you're going to learn God's names. As you'll see, we're going to highlight what we're doing over here, and I'm hoping that everybody here is able to see what I highlight. If you're able to see what I highlight, I'd like you to type in the number 2 so I can see that you're with me. And tonight you're going to learn God's names and the messages of some of those names. I want to make sure that that's clear. We're about 15 minutes into our webinar, into our workshop, because we like to start a little bit on Jewish time to give everybody a chance to get in on time. And the recognizing the name in its original Hebrew is going to be an important component. We're going to see that in a little bit of a fuzzy Hebrew, because I wanted to show it to you in the original work, so you can actually see that there. And then but the 2 main names that we're going to cover, we'll cover in a much clearer fashion, and then understand the meaning behind the name. That we're going to delve into only a few of those names, because the topic would take us much longer than an hour workshop online. And then we're going to learn the importance to know and use the name as well. Now, one of the things I like to focus on in all of the courses that we teach at the Hebraics Institute is that we guarantee you'll succeed in your biblical studies the first time, and the primary reason for that is because our intent in teaching these are to empower you and to enable you to have the tools to understand the information. So before we go further, I want to tell you about the source books for the divine names. I'll show them to you over here, and they're going to come up pretty slowly just to sort of create a little bit of anticipation over there. As I mentioned tonight, we're going to touch upon and become a little familiar with some of the basic idea that are what's mysteriously known as divine names or God's hidden names to some degree. And as I mentioned again, my goal is not to try to teach anybody tonight to be a great Kabbalist. That's not the goal. However, we have 45 actual minutes to cover this whole idea. So what we're going to do is a bit of a quick introduction so you see how much depth there is out there. I'm not just trying to tease you. I want you to be able to see that there's a lot more than we're covering tonight. That's half of the lesson in its own right, to whet your appetite. And then we're going to cover three, we're not going to have time for the four, but three particular names a little bit in depth to give us some tangible lessons so that we can take away practical meaning from tonight. All right, so first, let's cover the straightforward response to the original question that led to tonight's workshop, which I'm going to actually ask you in a little bit in the text. But tonight's workshop was a response to some of the questions we received. And at this point in time, I'd like to encourage you to share with us the feedback. You can do that tonight, and I encourage you to do that tonight. We'll have a short time for questions and answers, but I'll tell you from experience, the only questions we'll be able to answer are the ones that are asked throughout the webinar, because if you wait to ask them later, there won't be any time left. The people who the earlier questions get answered earlier, and 15 minutes is not a very long time to answer a tremendous amount of questions. So if you have questions, ask them as they pop into your head. And you could do that through the chat model on the right side of your screen. So the question that we were posed is, if there's a one God, which, by the way, this belief in one God is one of those 7 universal laws. Every human being is obligated to believe in one God. Now, I want to establish something very clearly. Just as a parent who has multiple children has multiple relationships with those children, that means to say each child is unique. I think there's a beautiful saying that someone once expressed, that you are unique just like everyone else. But each level, each individual has a path and a journey for them to take. And this is one of the core Kabbalistic insights into the creation of the world, which is very fascinating. It says that no human being, as a matter of fact, it doesn't only limit it to human beings, but no creation of God's is truly redundant. For if it was redundant, he only would have created one, not both. So each individual has their own journey, has their own path to take, and therefore, even though we're speaking of 7 universal laws that everybody must believe in and follow, and that applies to all humanity, unlike, for example, the 613 biblical commandments, which do not apply to all humanity, certainly not equally so, there are different layers of expectations even within these 7 universal laws. And we'll leave it at that, because tonight we're not really covering the 7 universal laws, but if that's a request, we can certainly tackle that. It's a fascinating topic. With that being said, the belief in one God, and which is what the question that we were posed, so there's one God. How come he has so many different names? How come the Bible uses different names to refer to this one God? And anybody who's a serious biblical student will come across not just multiple names, but different names for different people or different requests. So, for example, the famous challenge that Moses, before redeeming the Jewish people from Egypt, asked God to know his name. And God seemingly, at least on face value, seemed to say to Moses and chastise him and say to him, how could you ask me for my name when your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, did whatever I asked of them without asking me their name? Nonetheless, God took the time to answer and address Moses' question, and he did give him his name, and he said his name is E'eke, which we're going to replace, in order not to use God's name in vain, the hey, the H sound in that name, so that we don't pronounce it, even though we're studying about it, which is a good use of that. But we've come to become very sensitive to the prohibition of using God's name in vain, and therefore, whenever it's out of context of a written verse, we don't pronounce it fully. So Moses was told the name of God, which is, I will be what I will be. And if we have time, we'll delve into exactly what that means and what that name actually means. But let's take us back to a little bit of the source material here. That was just a brief introduction. Welcome to all those who just joined. I do want to mention at this point that if you join late, it will bring you from the beginning of the webinar. And you'll notice on the bottom there's a little button next to the word live. If you click on that, if you ever fall behind or if anybody buffers, it'll bring you up to speed into the live course that we're taking right now. So you won't have to rewatch the part of the webinar that you watched already. All right, so the question, straightforward, was, if there's one God, how come there's so many names, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to begin by introducing the main sources for tonight's workshop. These primary works address the topic being discussed tonight. And together we're going to take a look at some of the original source pages. Even though the print is going to be a little bit fuzzy, I'll give you that as a pre-warning. But the idea is I want to give you the idea, and again, my goal is to show you how and where these things are learned from, rather than just share the information with you. And the goal, again, with doing that is primarily just to show you that we're just touching upon a drop in the bucket of what is actually out there and being taught about these divine names. So, first of all, the answer to the question. In essence, in reality, the question is, if there's one God, how come there's so many names? The answer is, in essence, God has no name. He is infinite and cannot be given any titles or description. So you can say, and a name, what is a name? So there's a famous riddle that's posed that asks, what is it that your parents give you right in the beginning of your life, and then they go on to use a lot more than you do? And obviously the answer is a name. So let's focus on what a name is over here. But before we do that, I will tell you the names and the messages of those books that we just covered, we were showing you just a moment ago. The goal of showing it to you is just to let you know we're going to learn it from the original. But we'll get back to that in just a moment, okay? Whoops. I apologize. We're in fact 2 pages there. So we are going to take us to what the meaning of a name is. Before you can understand and answer the question, which is a very valid question, by the way, if there's one God, why is there so many names for that one God? We need to understand what a name is. So as we discussed, or we very briefly showed you on the screen, a name is a means by which one is made known to others. If you were all alone, if there was nobody else, you wouldn't need a name. So why does God need a name altogether is the question. So in order to understand that, I want to just take you through a little bit of a flow from the creation of the world, so you understand a little bit about this. Now, simply put, if you're in reality, if God is infinite, He doesn't need and He doesn't have a name that can truly, by definition, define Him, because something that's infinite can't be fully defined. There is no parameter, there's no limit. So the name of God became a concept when God made a choice to create a world. With creation, God chooses, therefore, to become involved with his own thought of a physical world, and those words are very, very carefully said, meaning to say that the world ultimately is created through the thought and the speech of God, not outside or separate of God. And when he became involved with his own thought of a physical world, descending, so to speak, within this world, this creation, this concept, then he chooses to have a relationship to us, the creations, the creation of the world and the creations upon that world. He now assumes, therefore, many descriptions. He's a creator. We're the creation. He's the creator. He's also the ultimate judge. He's the merciful one, the master, the almighty, etc. So the short and simple, straightforward answer to why does God, who is one God, have many names, is that in reality he has no name. But in his relationship to us, he plays many roles, and those roles are defined by names. That's the Midrash Rabbah, actually, on Shemot, on Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, just so you know where it comes from. Now, this is discussed at length by one of the great philosophers of all time, Maimonides, known as the Rambam, his name was Moses ben Maimon, and he wrote a phenomenal work of Jewish philosophy called the Moira Nevuchim in Hebrew, or the Guide to the Perplexed. And it's available in many translations. Many of them are good translations. Many of them are not yet such good translations. But they're available, and I encourage you to and challenge you to take a look at that. So we got the basic straightforward question, and we have the basic straightforward answer. However, that doesn't do it justice. What we're going to try to touch upon tonight is the Kabbalistic, the inner parts of Torah's addressing this topic, which is, it takes the concept of the name one step further. Now, what does it do? What it does is, and let me just take you back one moment again to the cover of those two volumes that are the source material for tonight's work. These two books, I'm going to tell you a little bit about them very quickly, and then we're going to jump right into them, and you're going to actually get a chance to look at the original language there, the Hebrew, and the meaning of it, okay? Let's see over here. Bear with me. It doesn't seem to want to show you the right page. Huh. Okay, well, it's not as important. I'm not going to struggle with it. But the two books that we showed you the cover of before, one of them was written by one of the great Kabbalists, known as the Maharal of Prague. His name was Rabbi Yehuda Lowy, who lived and was the chief rabbi of Prague, the city of Prague. Actually, to this day, anybody who visits the city of Prague will see a large statue that they made to honor him. So if we'll ever get the computer to cooperate over here, I'll try to show you those two titles again. What is important, though, regardless of what the computer is going to allow me to show you right now or not let me to show you, is that we're going to jump right in over here. And there's also another book called Shari Oira, which is one of the great earlier Kabbalists who teaches us a lot about the divine names as well. Okay? So this text in front of you, I don't want you to get too nervous. We're not going to make you read this. All of it, and this is very unclear. First of all, the image itself is the scan, unfortunately, didn't come in the quality that we'd like it to be. But as you'll notice, part of it is a little bit shaded out, and part of it is darkened. That's the part that I'm going to see if I can't highlight this for you. It won't let me highlight it because it's scanned it as an image. But not the first paragraph, but the fourth big word on the right side, that discusses the Shemot, or the names of God. And that's the part that we're going to actually discuss tonight a little bit to get us into the deeper meaning of the the names that the Medrash and the Moreh Nevuchim just tells you straightforward. We're going to get into a little bit of that. So right over here, you'll see we're going to separate all of the rest, and we're going to talk about the 10 names that can't be erased. Okay? So even though God doesn't have a name, in his essence he's infinite, his names became a name and a topic altogether when he chose to create a world. And therefore he relates to us with different aspects, and those aspects are different names of God. I hope that's clear. If that isn't clear, please type in the number 7, and I'll try my best to explain it to you a little bit again. If it is clear, give me a 5 on your chat model over there, okay? And then we'll jump right in over here. We're going to read. Now you'll notice even over here I shaded out some of the text, and I highlighted in the dark black only the part that we're going to actually speak about tonight, which that black font is actually, okay, the names of the books someone asked. That's a very good question. Let's answer the questions at the end. We'll come back and we'll take the time to answer all of those, okay? But definitely ask those questions now. I could tell you right off the bat, though, that those books are not translated into English, unfortunately. There's many works out there that are still waiting a decent translation, or a translation altogether. So Kabbalah, which is what we're studying right now, this deeper insight into the meaning of God's names, is going to take it one step further, and it's going to take us into the different layers, if you will, or different components of the way God relates to his creation, to us, and the world that we live in. The source for all of creation in Kabbalistic works is referred to by the name of Or Ein Sof, which is a light that has no end, the infinite light, and that is the source for all existence. Now, in order for such an intense energy to translate into a creation, a world that we can actually live in and exist as a separate entity, or at least in a manner that we feel separate from the Creator, it must be filtered through many what we call finite vessels. And in Hebrew, that's referred to as kalim. Now, we are not talking about containers. When I say a vessel, I don't mean a pot or a big plastic container you can go pick up at Walmart. What I'm referring to is a spiritual entity, almost, if you want to think about it, as a sort of a chamber or a varied aspect of a single whole. In a sense, I like to use electricity as an example, or as light. You can think of it as a certain wavelength that is actually being expressed through. Now, we know that with sound, for example, anybody who has a pet will be aware that the animals are able to hear things at a higher wavelength than we are. Their hearing is more sensitive often. We also know now, and it's being used in many different uses, that there are certain lights that we do see and certain ones that we don't. There's a certain, if you have the right tools, you can utilize the right lights to do certain things, and that's also, light also travels in a different wavelength, and that's what it's expressing. So when you think of vessels, I want you to have the right picture. I don't want you to picture a very primitive idea of a bucket, but we're talking about a much more refined, a much more subtle aspect. These are vessels only because they are now in a receiving mode. Whereas when they turn around and sustain the next level, they're actually a source of light as well. So we're not going to get into that because that requires a whole webinar on its own. But the names of God refer to light as it is channeled through these kalim, these wavelengths or modes of communication. Now, there are 7 names of God that are not permitted to be erased due to their holiness, and those correspond to those 7. It's not an accident that there are 7 of those. They correspond to the lower 7 of the 10 divine attributes. God decided to create the world with the number 10 in the sense that there are 10 powers and 10 elements, if you will, within every single level of creation. Now, in reality, Jewish law only discusses the 7 that cannot be erased, but we're going to try to, tonight, at least introduce the 10, because the 10 correspond to all 10 of those powers within creation. Now, there's two important, before we could go forward, so that nobody walks away with a misconception or misunderstanding of this, there's two things that are crucial to understand. First of all, we pray directly to God, not to these sephirot, not to these 10 attributes or divine attributes. Our prayers and our relationship is with God. That's like the child who goes to camp and he writes home. The only reason why he writes home is because he needs more money. So for someone to think that you're praying to a name or a divine attribute of God is only to relate not to the essence of God, but to what God does for you. It's a tremendously selfish relationship. But worse than just being selfish is that it is borderline idol worship. So again, we're not going to become truly masters of every aspect of this tonight, but I'm introducing the idea to you so you have a very basic understanding, and then we'll delve into one or two at this point probably of those names and try to understand them properly. Okay, so first and foremost, these sephirot are mere tools. Then we actually refer to this in our prayers. We refer to it as an axe in the hands of the wood chopper. Now, there's a famous song now, I believe, by Matisyahu, who sings about that. The same way, you would never praise an axe for chopping down a tree. Wow, you did a great job in chopping down that tree. Rather, you recognize it's the wood chopper who's using the tool to do that. The same is true as well over here. The sephirot, the divine powers, the attributes that are used in creation are merely tools in the hands of the woodchopper, and the woodchopper being God, the creator in this case. Okay, so when we wish to relate to God as He is compassionate, for example, so we use the appropriate name to, so to speak, elicit that compassion. And when we're appealing to Him to exercise justice, so we use the name that calls upon the mode of justice. And this is where Kabbalah directly relates and answers the question of why does one God, He's still one, in His simplest form, it's only one. However, He'll have multiple names because we relate to different components and different attributes of His. Now, by the way, the same with any prayer. The prophets and sages who composed the prayers knew precisely which names to use for the appropriate effect, and that's why in many of the Hebrew prayers you'll find different names are used for different prayers. Just a brief demonstration of the application of the knowledge. If you know the names, you know how to relate. As a matter of fact, there's an early Kabbalistic work which tells us that anybody whose prayer, it's pretty harsh and straightforward, he's very unapologetic, but he says anybody whose prayer is not granted is merely because he doesn't know how to approach God with the correct name. Because God is ready and willing and able and waiting to grant your request. But you just have to know how to approach Him. You have to know the name to call. You have to know the right room to attend, to approach. And when you do, the door is open and waiting for you. And we'll get to that at the end of tonight. I'll tell you a beautiful story and a message, a teaching from the Baal Shem Tov on the topic of knowing the divine names, but we'll get to that later. So let's jump right in over here. That was number one. Number two, before we can read this text itself, so number one, just to reiterate, and if everybody could reassure me that they got number one correctly, please type in 1. I'll reiterate and summarize it for you very quickly. Number one is that just because there are multiple names and multiple attributes, God forbid, don't think that we pray to them. We only pray to God directly. Okay? They are merely the axe in the hand of the woodchopper. Rule number 2, God is not bound by any rules or systems. He creates those rules and systems. He's not bound by them. He's not limited by anything. Now, lights and vessels are the manner, the system, if you will, that God decided to generate and sustain a world. At any point, he can achieve whatever goals he wishes to achieve, with or without the mediums that he set in place. Now that we have those two understandings, let's jump into what the names are. Now, as I mentioned, as I asked you, I told you this answer before, so I'm going to ask now, and I'd like to see everybody respond in your chat model. If you can let me know, module on the right side over there. How many names are there of God? I'm going to give everybody a chance to scratch their head now and think. And I'm expecting and anticipating some of the answers over here. However, I have to tell you something. Even though we referred to these 10 names of God, do not think that there's only 10 names of God. As a matter of fact, the Kabbalists tell us that there are many hundreds of names of God. Names used in other languages, by the way, also count. And in fact, many halachic authorities, which is the halachic codifiers, which is the law, the biblical law that we follow, they actually apply the prohibition of do not take God's name in vain to apply to any name that is used to refer to God. And, for example, if somebody casually says, "Oh my God," right, that would accordingly actually be viewed as a transgression of this serious prohibition of not taking God's name in vain. However, the 7 especially holy names of God, and in reality there's 10, but Jewish law only deals with the 7 because that's the common knowledge. The reason why they cannot be erased and they have to be written with special concentration is because of the holiness that these names contain, and therefore we restrict their use only to prayer. And when we read them, we pronounce them, if they're not within the context of prayer, we pronounce them by one sort of broad paintbrush that we use, and we say Hashem. Hashem means, literally, if you translate it, it means the name. Hey is a prefix in Hebrew. It means the. Shem is Hebrew for name. So these 10 names over here, in this particular work over here, that's okay. I see some great questions popping up. Keep those coming. Don't stop. So and there is a 72 letter name of God that someone made a reference to, but that doesn't mean that there are 72 names of God. I just wanted to jump out and answer a couple of those questions really quickly. There's actually hundreds of names of God, but the 72 letters, which I really hope to cover tonight, is the way you spell the 4-letter name of God. That's probably the most well-known name of God. So let's take a look at what he says here. He says, Hashemot, the names, Haketuvim b'Torah, which are written in the Torah, in the Bible, She'enim nimchakim, which are not allowed to be erased, Hey Masara, they are 10. And then he goes on to spell them out for you here. And you'll notice that the letters are missing part of the Hey, because you don't spell them out fully. And these names that are 10 right over here, you'll see them in the dark black. That we're looking now at the screen that says the 10 names can't be erased. You'll see them over there. Each one is grouped sometime with an apostrophe. Let's just see if we can zoom in on that here. It's not going to let us do that. But those black letters or black words are the 10, so you can count them. The first group is 4 letters. The next one is 2 letters. The next one is 4 letters again, and it's described, and I'm going to have an English transliterated guide for you in just a moment, but I wanted to show it to you in the original over here. You'll be able to understand it, I think, a lot better in the English. So let's take you over there very quickly, because I can't highlight this, unfortunately, as it is an image. So here are the 10 names that cannot be erased. Let's take a quick look at them. And again, these are not even the 10 names. We're not going to go into them in depth, but at least you'll understand and you'll be aware of them. So you're aware of what the Kabbalists refer to as the 10 holiest names. Now, what are they? Starting from the left side, the name, this is called Eka. And this represents, as I'll show you in just a moment, this is a diagram of those 10 powers that we refer to that you may have come across. It's become very popular lately with the watering down, and I understand people utilize this symbol on it as a popular tattoo even, which is such an ironic statement because the Bible prohibits tattoos, but people go ahead and try to use something so holy to demonstrate that. It's a very interesting idea. But we're not going to get into that tonight. That's a whole different can of worms. So over here you have the 10 powers, Keter being crown, and the top of them, as you'll notice in just a moment when we go back, that's the first name over here, and that represents the attribute of desire. I have to tell you that these English one-word translations don't do even an iota of justice to what these ideas are, but for lack of a better ability to express that in a lengthy class on its own, we're going to just give you the reference to it. But again, try not to misunderstand those. So desire is an attribute that really actually is the source for everything else afterwards. If you don't have any desire to get involved, or as we're referring to here, the creation of the world, so God desired to create a world. And that's why the rest of the world was created. So that's the first one. Then comes the Yud and the Hey, which is pronounced Ka, if you're not pronouncing it fully. And in general, all of these names are not going to be pronounced unless they're being said in prayer. Chokhmah, it stands for wisdom, which is the beginning of the intellectual process, which is the highest faculty of human being. Then comes the four-letter name of God, which is known as Yud, and then a Hey, and then a Vav and a Hey, which many people in English will put a Y and a H because those are the sounds that those letters make, but that doesn't even come close to doing justice to what it's describing. It's a whole different shape. And that represents Bina, which means understanding. The difference between wisdom and understanding is wisdom is the flash of knowledge, of wisdom, of an idea that you have no idea where it came from. You just get this bright idea, this flash of inspiration. The next level dissects it, and it understands it. It takes it apart, and it says it begins here and it ends here, and this is true, and this is what it doesn't mean, etc. And then comes the third level, which is, and in this particular diagram, we go, because we have Keter, which is the desire, we don't have the next one, which would normally be here, which would be knowledge. Okay? But if you take away the Keter, then you would have knowledge, which applies the intellect into emotions. And then comes the 7 emotions, which is, over here, as you'll notice, the name on the left is Kale, and that represents kindness or loving kindness. And the next name is Elokim, which is one of the names we're actually going to delve into tonight, and that represents Gevura, or judgment, or might, the ability as well to hold back. It represents discipline. Then going on to the right side, the right column over here, you'll see that it says this is God's name, but it's punctuated in the earlier case as Elokim, meaning to say its pronunciation would be Elokim. In this case, it's Tzivakot, which means it's the higher, in a sense, level, and it's punctuated as such. The next one will be the same name, but with a different punctuation, even though it's referred to with the same Hebrew, and this represents compassion. Then comes the next one, which again is the Tzavakot, and that represents Netzach, which means victory or perseverance, the ability to hold through, to last through a difficult situation. Then comes the next one is Elokim Tzivakot, which is a combination of 2 of those names, and it represents Hod, or glory, or if you want to try to understand it in your psychological makeup, it would be humility. And then comes the name, which is the protective name of God, which we recite in the Aleinu prayer, and is also written on the mezuzah, the scroll that is the commandment to put on your doorpost. There's the protective name on the front of it, which is the name Shakai, Shin, and then a Dalid, and then a Yud, and that represents the foundation, the Yesod, and that's why, by the way, that is the protective name, because it ensures with a proper foundation you can have a healthy building, you can have a healthy ascent, and if you have a proper foundation, then you're protected. Even if there's a storm, the metaphor used in the philosophical discussions of this is you can have a top-heavy tree, and a tree that has few roots but many branches comes along a small storm and it'll topple over. But whereas a tree that has many roots, even if it only has a few branches, it will never be toppled over by a wind because it has a proper foundation. That's the protective name of God. And then finally, the name which is most commonly pronounced when we are reading all of the spellings of these names is, as we refer to it when we're not saying it in prayer, Adnai, which means the master. That represents Malchut, which is royalty, sovereignty, the leadership, the Almighty. So that was very, very primitive discussion of the 10 names, just so you actually have them. We're not going to delve into all of them. But what we are going to do, and again, they represent this map, as you'll notice. You have the crown up above, the wisdom on the right side. On the left side, you'll have the understanding. Then you have the kindness on the right side. You have the might, the gevurah, or the discipline, the judgment on the left side. And then in the middle. So these are all, every line that connects it means that it relates to it directly in a different fashion. And then you go through the whole map like that. But tonight's not about the Kabbalah per se and the diagram of creation. Again, if that's a question of yours, we can certainly look into that. Let's look at a verse. Now, this particular verse is from Exodus, right before the Ten Commandments. It tells us a very fascinating thing over here that Moses tells us about right before he begins the Ten Commandments. What does he say? He says, Anoichi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God, and that's the first of the Ten Commandments. But right before that, bear with me 1 second, I'm just going to pull up the full verse, which I thought I had open here, but we'll read it together over here. This is verse 2 of chapter 20 of Exodus. 20 or 21? Let's see here, 1 second. Well, I don't want to wait, but we'll get into that in just a moment, and I'll tell you exactly where I'll read you the verse beforehand. Okay. By the way, the word Anochi, which is just an interesting point to point out over here for those who have already mastered the ability to read the Hebrew, and I'm assuming that you could see me highlight this word right now. Okay. So, and again, we're going to answer those. Keep the questions coming. We're going to answer them when we get to our questions and answers. So, Anochi, you may think it's a Hebrew word, but it's actually, believe it or not, even though it's used in the Bible, it is an Aramaic word. And there's a specific reason for that. But it's the opening of the Ten Commandments, as they're known, and the lesson tonight doesn't allow us to discuss the meaning of each of those words, but again, that's possibly a topic we could delve into at a different time. So, Anochi means I am. Hashem, you see over here, this is God's name. This name that I just highlighted is the way you spell the four-letter name of God. And when you say the four-letter name of God, this is really the name that all the other names, for example, I saw before someone made a reference to the 72 name of God, right? That was Rose. It's this name. It's not another name. It's just a question of how this name is spelled, with the spelling out of each letter, and the permutations of each letter can be spelled out in its full component. That's how you get to the 72-letter name. But it's still these four letters, just in a different form.
So this ultimately is the creative name of God. When we speak of God, and you speak of God's name and the oneness of God, this is in reality the name that we're discussing. So this is ultimately the ultimate name of God. And everything else comes from this name. But you'll notice in this very verse, okay, the very verse that we're actually referring to over here, the Ten Commandments, it doesn't just use one name of God. It says, I am the Lord, your God. Right? You see that? So it says, Anochi Hashem Yudke Vavke, that's translated as the Lord here. And then it says the next name of God, which is Elokecha. And if you pronounced it in the full verse, it would be with a hey, with the H sound instead of the K sound. So, with that being the case, you see over here that there's two different names of God used in telling us that He is the God who took us out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, which is a very, very fascinating idea. Make up your mind. Is it the Yud Kei Vav Kei or is it Elokecha? Now, in reality, it's important to understand it's both of those in the sense, and I'm going to explain that to you very quickly. What does it mean that it's both the real name of God, if you will, or the essential name of God, the Yud Kei Vav Kei, which is the one that's not being highlighted right now, but it is now. I'm going to highlight it here. It's on the first line here, whereas there's the second name over here, Elokecha. So to understand that, we need to understand something a little bit prior to actually getting into the name itself. Okay, when Moses was about to take us out of Egypt, so one of the things that I made a reference to before was he asked God. He says, "What is your name?" I'm going to come to them to take them out of Egypt, and they're going to say to me, "What is your name?" So I need to know what is your name. Now he wasn't asking God what the simple knowledge of God's name is, because we would have had that passed down from generation to generation. As a matter of fact, what he was really asking is that if I'm going to be a prophet, I'm going to be the leader of the Jewish people, I'm going to be taking them out of Egypt, and I'm going to be enabling them to become your people, they're going to want to know more about you. And within your name is where we learn about you. And that's why, even though God at first chastised seemingly Moses to tell him, what does that mean that you're going to ask me for my name? Your ancestors did everything I asked of them without asking me such a question. The answer there, and then God went on to answer him, wasn't saying that your question is not valid, Moses. What he was saying is just an aspect of that the forefathers, as they're known, even though there's three of them, the four means before, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had a what we call Kabbalah's Ol. They had an obedience to God that was unstinting and unquestioning. And that's the point that God was telling Moses. However, he recognized the point that Moses made, which was that if they are going to mature, if the people are going to become God's people, they are going to need to know how to relate to God and to understand God better. And therefore, they will, in fact, need to know God's name. And even though God bemoaned the fact that that, by definition, means there'll be less of an obedience because there'll be a greater understanding, and both of those are beautiful qualities in their own right, but obviously God acquiesced and he recognized Moses' request, and therefore he taught him his name. He said, I will be what I will be, which is, again, a reference to this name over here that I'm highlighting now. So there's these two names. Now, what's the difference between the first name over here, which is God, and then your God over here? How come there's that difference? So obviously, if it's your God, right, that's what it means. That's already relating to the creation a lot more. So the Yud Kei Vav Kei, this name over here, is the creative power without being involved particularly with the creation that it creates. It's the source of creation. You may recall we made a reference before to Or Ein Sof, that infinite light. That's represented by this Yud Kei Vav Kei. And this four-letter name is the process of that infinite light funneling into a creation. And each of these letters actually are in the shape of the mode that they fulfill in the creation. So the Yud represents that wisdom, that flash of knowledge that we made a reference to before. The Hey is the understanding. It spreads out that little dot. And then the Vav draws it down, etc., and so on and so forth. But Elokecha, the next name, means your God. That is already a name of God referring to an existing world. As a matter of fact, Elokecha, or Elokim, which is the name, Elokecha is the way it relates to you, so it's your God. That's a suffix, the chaf at the end over here. But the real name over here would be Elokim if it wasn't being described as your God. And that is the source of creation and of nature. And so much so, anybody who was in an earlier webinar where we talked about gematria, the numerical value, or some people call it numerology, although I shy away from that because it has its own little baggage that comes along with it. But gematria is a valid insight into the Torah, into the Bible, and you'll notice that so much so is Elokim a reference to the way God creates the material world or nature, and some people refer to it nature with a capital N, as you'll see. That's when they try to refer to God without actually referring to God, or some people call Mother Nature, is the same numerical value as Elokim, because that's the name of God that relates to the shield, the ability to hide the Creator so the creation feels as if it really exists on its own. As long as a creation is totally aware of its Creator, it's not a creation. The definition of creation means something that feels that it is separate from its Creator. And a metaphor for that would be a ray of light from the sun. While that ray of light is in the sun, you can't even call it a ray of light. It is only referred to as a ray of light when it leaves its source, and it's separate, it's, so to speak, outside of the source of light, which is the sun, and then you can identify it as something separate. And Elokim, which is also why you'll notice this name is in the plural format. And again, I say you'll notice, I don't expect everybody's knowledge of Hebrew to be necessarily where everybody hopes it would be, but Elokim is a plural expression of God, whereas, for example, Yudke Vavke would be singular. And the reason why it's plural is not because, God forbid, there's more than one God, but because this is describing the way God is involving himself in a world which does have distinction and does feel separate from his simple oneness, and therefore it uses a term that's or name that's written and said in a plural form. So let's take a look at the gematria, the numerical value, and then we will just summarize these ideas that we didn't fully finish quite yet, and then we will get into your questions and answers for a few minutes over here. So Elokim, you'll notice that this is the way it's spelled: Aleph, Lamed, Hey, Yud, and the Mem that's on the top. You'll notice the numerical value is right underneath it in the box. There is 1 is the Aleph, Lamed is 30, Hey is 5, Yud is 10, and the Mem, that's a final Mem, is 40. That equals 86. And Hateva, which is the word for the nature that God creates, which, by the way, is a greater miracle than an ordinary miracle, if you will, because it is a miracle that occurs every day consistently. And anybody who tries to do something consistently knows that that's much harder than doing it one time. Hateva in Hebrew, which means the nature, is also 86. 5 for the Hey, 9 for the Tet, 2 for the Bet, or the Vet, and 70 for the Ayin, which equals to 86. So you'll see over here that the name of God, Elokim, represents the relationship of God involving himself in creating a world that feels as if it functions on its own, as it's a separate being. All right? And as I promised you earlier, I wanted to, even though each of the names of God, as I hope that you've taken from tonight's workshop, is another, if you will, key to relating to another layer or level of God and the way He relates to His creation. That's the essential point that I want you to walk away from tonight's workshop understanding. Obviously, we addressed the simple meaning of the question. If there's one God, why is there multiple names? So we mentioned that, and I'll just reiterate that very, very quickly, that essentially God doesn't have a name. A name is only something you need to relate to something else. So the names of God are only really became an entity once God chose to create a world, and once the beginning process of creation happens, there's different layers of relationship and different modes of creation that those different names relate to. And the simple answer that we quoted from the Guide for the Perplexed in the Midrash Rabbah was that because He has a different relationship with us, we relate to Him with different names in that aspect. Then we went into the Kabbalistic component, and we helped try to introduce, and I hope we succeeded. And if we did succeed, I'd love to see you give us a high five in the comments over here. Tell us a 5 so that I make sure that we actually understood that properly. That each of these names is in reality another key, if you will, to opening up another chamber or secret or relationship with our Creator and developing our existence and our relationship with Him. So the names of God are really meant to be thought of as keys. Now, with that being said, there's a beautiful, appropriate story right before Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, which is really the New Year for the world, even though it's often referred to as the Jewish New Year. And the mitzvah, the obligation of the day of Rosh Hashanah is to sound the shofar. As a rabbi, I like to joke that when they say that Jews have horns, these are the horns that they're referring to. And this is the one time that the Bible obligates us to toot our own horn. And the blowing of the shofar is the obligation of the day. And it's the tremendous accomplishment of the day as well. Now, the day of Rosh Hashanah has many, many other aspects to it, but that's the obligation of the day. So the Baal Shem Tov, who was the founder of the Hasidic movement, a great Kabbalist in his own right, a great, great teacher, would at times delegate the responsibility for very important steps to some of his tremendous students. Some of the outstanding students would be given the honor of fulfilling a role in the service in his temple, in his synagogue. And this particular student was chosen by the Baal Shem Tov to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. And when he was asked to blow the shofar for Rosh Hashanah, he was told to take that very seriously and to study all of the mystical meanings and understandings of the divine names that are called and utilized in the process of blowing the shofar. So you may think that we're simply sounding a horn. In reality, there's a tremendous amount of depth in each of those sounds that call forth to different names of God. And with those names, while you blow the shofar, you're supposed to meditate on those names to be able to open each of those chambers and accomplish the full accomplishment of what each of those shofar sounds are supposed to accomplish. So this student realized the severity and the importance of the job he was honored with, and he was worried that he didn't want to forget or not fully fulfill the obligation and the honor that was given to him. So he decided to make himself a cheat sheet, and he wrote down the very basic references, the bullets, if you will, of the meanings behind the names of the sounds that the shofar makes. And he took that paper and he put it into his jacket pocket, so he would have it with him that he could review right before he had to actually sound the shofar. Now, when he came to the synagogue, he felt very comfortable, very satisfied that he was very well prepared. The Baal Shem Tov noticed, and the Baal Shem Tov thought to himself, oh no, this is not going to work. So, however he did it is not for tonight, but that paper managed not to be in his jacket pocket when it came time for him to sound the shofar. Now you can imagine, here he was all prepared, and he reached into his jacket pocket, and he pulled out, or thought he was going to pull out the paper, to quickly review all of the thoughts that he needed to review, and it wasn't there. And his mind went blank, and he was broken. Here, his teacher gave him such a huge responsibility and such a great honor to sound the shofar on behalf of everybody, and he could not remember a single one of the mystical names that he was supposed to think about while he sounded the shofar. And he was brokenhearted. But what could he do? He had the obligation, so he sounded the shofar. You can imagine at the end of the service, he wanted to bury his head in the ground. He didn't want to say anything to anybody, but much to his chagrin, the Baal Shem Tov, his teacher, came over to him in a warm embrace and thanked him for the most beautiful shofar blowing with the most mystical accomplishments that he's ever heard in his life. And he was shocked. He asked his teacher, are you making fun of me? I was at a loss. I was brokenhearted. I couldn't remember any of them. So the Baal Shem Tov said, let me tell you something. He said, each of those divine names is one key to open up one aspect, one chamber of the creation of the world of godliness. However, there's one master key. There's one key that opens up all of the gates, every chamber in heaven, every aspect of godliness in the world. And that key, that master key, that is a broken heart. And when I saw you come to this temple, to the synagogue, with a smug smile, a comfort that you thought you were going to be able to accomplish everything, I realized that we need some help over here. And when you blew the shofar with a truly broken heart because you felt that you didn't have all of the tools, you accessed the master key that opened up every one of those aspects of relationship with God that the names represent. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we conclude the idea that we've discussed of the divine names of God and their meaning. I hope that teaches us a very profound lesson about the ability that we have with a sincere heart. You can sometimes accomplish more than you can accomplish with knowledge. I do want to take a moment now to answer your questions, but before we do, I want to let everybody know that we're very proud to tell you that the Hebraic seminar coming up on the 15th and 16th is now closed, but there will be, God willing, if you go to Hebraics.org, you'll be able to see the upcoming seminars where we cover both the ability and training for everybody to have the tools that they need to access the Bible and to read the Bible themselves, and also the full scope of biblical prophecy, of understanding it and learning to be able to recognize the realization and the materialization of biblical prophecies in our day, which are happening around us on a daily basis. At this point in time, we'll take your questions and answers for a few minutes, even though technically speaking, we spent the time of our webinar. If you guys will bear with me, I will go through all of the questions that you have asked, and I'll try to address them. If you have any questions that do not get addressed, do not hesitate for a moment to email info@Hebraics.org, and that's IN. I'll type it in over here so you'll have it, and we'll be happy to answer any of those questions. Here we go. Okay, that's the email address. You can copy that down and send any of your questions too. Let's go back to the beginning over here and see if we can answer some of these questions that were asked in the beginning. Again, we're not going to be able to get to every question, but I'll do my best in responding to the ones that we see as we go along. And welcome to everybody from all over the United States, from Massachusetts to Colorado to California to right over here in our backyard, St. Louis and Illinois. We're glad to have all of you. And if you've enjoyed tonight, we hope that you'll take the time to like our Facebook page and follow us and share the information with others, because if you like information and if it's good information, you shouldn't hold it to yourself. So, first of all, we touched upon the different names of God. As we discussed, to answer your question, yes, God has no name essentially. However, even if words put limits on him, the only one who can put a limit on God. Let me just say the question first. The question is, how can God have a name if God is infinite and words are limited, a name is limited, and therefore an infinite and an unlimited God can't possibly have a name? And that's one of the topics we actually covered tonight, that in reality, in essence, he has no name. However, his name is by choice. He can place a limitation on himself, not that he's truly limited by that, but by choice he chooses to have a name so that he can relate to us. All right, so that's the direct answer to that question. Someone asked about the diagram that we showed, the Kabbalistic diagram. I'll try to go back to it very quickly. So you can see the Kabbalistic diagram of the shape of the 10 Sefirot, or the 10 powers of creation, which we have right over here. So Keter, which we define as desire. So there's, within each of these, there's an inner and an outer. The inner is desire, and the outer will be will. And what's the difference between something that's inside and outside? So let's take, for example, the difference between thought and speech. Thought will be speech on the inside, and speech is thought on the outside. Okay, so when you have something that we call the inner, that means it doesn't relate. That's the way it's in its essence. That's the way it is for itself. It doesn't communicate that with others. But the way it serves, it plays a role as communicating to others, that will be considered its outside. In Kabbalistic terminology, we call that pnim and chutz, or pnimiyut and chitzoniyut, the inner and the outer, the interior and the external. So the inner component of Keter is referred to as desire, and the external component is referred to as will. So will is the way your desire is expressed in your outer powers, if you will, or in the way you relate to others, or the way it's related to. Getting back to our questions and answers, let's see over here. We have, and if this topic in general was what you thought we would cover when you signed up for this webinar, please give us a 2 in the notes right now. If this was not at all what you were hoping to study, I do ask that you, first of all, give us a 3, but also tell us what it was that you were hoping to hear tonight, because I'm curious to know so we can address it in the future. So that's the answer of what Keter is. That Keter is will, the crown is will, but it's also, in reality, desire, which is actually the internal aspect of will. I'm not sure I understand. Julian, you have a question. I don't fully understand what that is, but you can email me and spell the question out fully, and I'll certainly answer that as well. Are there any other questions that, let me see over here. Okay, what are the names of the books? Someone asked that we had discussed all the way at the beginning of tonight's course. So let's see if we can't get all the way back to the beginning and find those 2 pages that refused to open for us before. I think now it will, hopefully. Looks like the pages are images that are very heavy, and it's taking a very long time to open those pages. Here we go, here we go. Okay, so the source for the divine names, these are the 2 books over here. So the one on the right side, if you can see that, is called Sefer Shnei Luchot HaBrit, which was written by Rabbi Yehoshua Horowitz. And the name of the book is actually on the top of that archway. It says Sefer Shnei Luchot HaBrit, the book of the 2 tablets of the covenant. And that is one of the great, great Kabbalistic works. And in that book, that's actually the book we read from. He discusses the meanings of the Hebrew names, the divine names of God, and then Shari Ora, which is the book on the left, which on the top of that it says Zeh Hashar La Hashem, this is the gate to God, also addresses and discusses a lot about the names of God, and we've quoted from that book as well in tonight's workshop. So now you have the two names of those books. Again, neither of these books were, to my knowledge, translated into another language. So unless you have access to it in the original Hebrew, it's really a closed book, unfortunately. Let's see if there's any other questions before we close out. And I look forward to that feedback to see if this was what you were hoping to get. Anybody who has any homework for me? There looks like there were a lot of people asking for certain things. I will ask you, if you don't mind, to email info@hebraics.org, and we will be happy to send you all that information that you're asking. And that is it for tonight's webinar and tonight's workshop. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And if you want to find out about all of the different offerings that we're providing, both the online workshops as well as the in-person seminars and many of our free downloads and information, I encourage you to follow us on Facebook. If you want to follow us on Facebook, all you have to do is go to facebook.com/Hebraics, which is HEBRAICS, and I'll actually post it over here as well. If anybody missed out on tonight's parts of tonight's workshop, or if you weren't able to stay till the end, there will be, or if you missed the beginning, there will be a replay that we will email you, and that's in general. Even if you can't make it to one, if you register, you'll have access to the replay as well. All right, everybody, have a wonderful evening, and if we don't speak to you beforehand, a happy and a healthy, sweet New Year. That New Year that's coming up on September 25th is the renewal for the entire world, and it's important for us to remember that. Have a good evening and a wonderful, wonderful week ahead, everybody.